They never told you this part of English history, because, if they did, you would see just how close the monarchy came to shattering forever. Imagine this: a woman trained from childhood to be an empress, promised the throne of England, stripped of her crown not by battle, but by betrayal. She had armies, she had allies, she had destiny, and yet, when she finally entered London to claim her throne, the same people who cheered her in the morning turned against her by nightfall. Why? Because she dared to act like a king. This isn't just a story about battles, it's about secrets whispered in darkened halls, about oaths sworn before God and broken in the heat of ambition. And at the center of it all is a single figure, Matilda, daughter of Henry I, a woman who would plunge England into nearly 20 years of chaos, a civil war so brutal they called it the Anarchy. But here's the forbidden truth: if just one night in London had gone differently, you wouldn't know the name of King Stephen, you'd know Queen Matilda, first of her line, asterisk. The story begins not with Matilda, but with her father, Henry I, son of the legendary William the Conqueror. The year is 1100. England is still a land divided. Scarred by the memory of conquest, the native English bowed under Norman rule, the castles of foreign lords stabbing the skyline. Henry, clever, calculating, and cold as steel, ascended the throne after his brother William II's sudden death, arrow to the chest on a hunting trip that looked a little too convenient to be fate. Henry ruled with a relentless grip. He was known as the Lion of Justice, but his justice was sharp-edged and merciless. He crushed rebellion, tamed barons, and filled his coffers with silver squeezed from every possible corner of his realm. But what haunted him most was succession. He had sons, yes, but fate has a cruel taste for irony. His legitimate son and heir, William Theling, drowned in 1120 in the icy waters of the English Channel after the drunken crew of the White Ship sailed into disaster. Picture it: the Channel at night, screams on the wind, the cold bite of salt and sea, the future of England sinking into black water. When news reached Henry, they say he never smiled again. The empire he had built trembled. Who now could inherit it? Here lies the first twist. Henry had a daughter. Unlike most daughters of kings, she had not been raised in the shadows of court embroidery and piety. No, she had been sent across the sea as a child to marry into one of the greatest dynasties in Europe. At just 12 years old, Matilda had become Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. Wife to Emperor Henry V, she was schooled in the art of rule, in imperial ceremony, in the subtle poison of politics. While other English lords raised their sons for knighthood, Matilda was learning how emperors commanded nations. But destiny shifted again. In 1125, her husband died suddenly. At only 23, the Empress was widowed, childless, and thrust back into her father's orbit. Henry saw in her something he had never expected, his last desperate hope. She would be his heir. The idea was radical, almost unthinkable. England had never crowned a woman king. Queens were wives, mothers, pawns in dynastic games. But Henry was adamant. He gathered his barons, the most powerful men in the realm, earls, bishops, warlords hardened by years of conquest, and he made them swear an oath. They would accept Matilda as their sovereign when he died. Swear it on holy relics. Swear it before God. Swear it while the king himself watched, and they did. They knelt, they kissed the cross, and one by one they promised, "Yes, my lord, when you die, Matilda shall rule England." Among those swearing that oath was a tall, ambitious noble named Stephen of Blois. Remember his name, because betrayal always comes from the ones who kneel the deepest. But Henry was not a fool. He knew oaths are fragile things, as weak as ambition is strong. To secure Matilda's claim, he remarried her to Geoffrey, heir to the powerful dukes of Anjou. Their marriage was fire and flint. He was 15, she was 26, and neither forgave the insult of the match. Yet it produced sons, heirs with the blood of both Normandy and Anjou. A dynasty Henry dreamed would rule for centuries. Still, time was running out. Henry's body, battered by years of war and rich feasts, finally gave way in 1135. And here comes the betrayal. Instead of sending word from Matilda, instead of honoring the oath sworn before God, the great barons turned to Stephen of Blois, the very man who had bent the knee years earlier. He moved fast, faster than anyone expected, racing across the channel with a storm at his back. Stephen seized the treasury, seized the crown, and had himself anointed king at Westminster before Matilda even heard her father was dead. Think about that moment. The daughter of an emperor, the rightful heir of Henry I, learned not just that her father was gone, but that her crown had been stolen. What would you have done? Rage, despair, or sharpened resolve? And so the stage was set. A promise broken, a kingdom stolen, a woman scorned. The anarchy was about to begin. But here's the question that still echoes through history. Did England betray Matilda, or did Matilda betray herself? The answer lies in what happened next. Chapter 1 ends. Chapter 2 begins with war. When Stephen seized the throne in December 1135, he thought the kingdom would fall into his hands as easily as a sword slips into its scabbard. For a moment, it seemed true. He had speed, charm, and most crucially, the blessing of the church. Because in medieval England, crowns were not secured on battlefields, but in cathedrals, with holy oil pressed into the forehead. Without it, Stephen was a usurper. With it, he was a king, ordained by God. So he moved first to win the bishops. His brother, Henry of Blois, was Bishop of Winchester, a man whose ambition burned as fiercely as any warrior's, except his weapons were parchments, pulpits, and papal seals. Henry smoothed the way. He whispered to the Pope's envoys, argued that Stephen was stability incarnate, that England could not suffer the gamble of crowning a woman. Within weeks, Stephen was crowned at Westminster Abbey, the golden circlet pressing against his temples while incense choked the air. But oaths have long memories, and Matilda did not forget. At first, she was stranded in Normandy with her young husband Geoffrey and their sons. She raged at the news, but fury could not raise armies overnight. Geoffrey cared more for his own lands in Anjou, lands constantly under threat from Norman barons eager to carve up weakness. The English barons, meanwhile, tested Stephen. Some bent the knee, eager for favor. Others held back, waiting to see whether Matilda would strike. And here is where the story takes its first great turn. For in those early years, it seemed Stephen might succeed. He moved across the realm like a whirlwind, crushing uprisings, scattering rebels, pouring gold into loyal hands. He bought peace with silver and promises, but what he bought was illusion, because every coin he handed out was a coin he no longer had to pay his knights. And knights fight for pay, not for love. By 1138, the cracks widened. Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother, made his move. Robert was no ordinary noble. He was Henry I's illegitimate son, a man of ambition and steel, and he had sworn the same oath to defend Matilda's right. His loyalty was not just blood, it was pride, defiance, perhaps even guilt, he declared for his sister. That same year, another threat bled into England, the Scots. King David I, Matilda's uncle, crossed the border, claiming he fought to uphold her cause. His armies carved through Northumberland, ravaging towns, until Stephen rode north and clashed with them at the Battle of the Standard. Picture the English banners raised high, saints painted on cloth, the clash of spears and hooves in August heat. Stephen's men triumphed that day, but the victory was hollow. The north burned, and the realm's fabric was fraying. Now the whispering began. Was Stephen truly a king chosen by God? Was he cursed? Why, after all, did famine stalk the countryside? Why did castles sprout like weeds? Why did noblemen grow fat on lawlessness? To peasants, it seemed as though the heavens themselves had turned against their monarch. Christ and his saints slept. Chroniclers would later write of these years, and through the chaos, Matilda gathered her strength. Normandy was hers first. Geoffrey Plantagenet waged brutal campaigns, burning and pillaging until barons bent the knee. Step by step, she secured the duchy, and with Normandy behind her, England was next. In 1139, Matilda landed on English shores. Imagine that moment, after 4 years of silence. The rightful heir finally sets foot in her kingdom, her banner snapping in the wind. With her came Robert of Gloucester and a small force, not enough to conquer, but enough to ignite rebellion. Castles opened their gates. Discontent boiled over, and the realm descended into civil war. The war was unlike the clean battles sung of by troubadours. It was not knights meeting in open fields, but sieges that starved towns, raids that left charred ruins, and shifting loyalties that turned friends into traitors overnight. Every castle became a kingdom, every baron a petty tyrant, and the people suffered. Farmers hid their meager grain in forest hollows. Churches were pillaged. Women and children starved, while lords feasted. Stephen, desperate to hold his crown, unleashed terror of his own. He granted castles freely to win loyalty, but the lords who received them used them to oppress. He captured rebels, but often lacked the will to execute them. Mercy, some called it. Weakness, others whispered. Matilda, watching, saw only opportunity. And then, in 1141, came the moment that changed everything. The Battle of Lincoln. It was February, bitter cold. Stephen marched to confront rebels who had seized the city, but he was outmaneuvered. Matilda's forces, led by Robert of Gloucester and Ranulph of Chester, encircled the king. The battle turned to slaughter. Stephen fought like a lion. Chroniclers marvel at his ferocity. How he swung his sword until it shattered. How he seized an axe and fought on until he was dragged to the ground, pinned beneath a press of enemies. Captured, yes, captured. The King of England, taken alive on the battlefield. And suddenly, the throne was empty. For Matilda, this was destiny's hour. Stephen was paraded in chains to Bristol, locked in a cell. The crown was hers to take, she marched toward London in triumph, cheered by her supporters. Chroniclers say she entered the city as though already a queen, and for a brief, dazzling moment, England had its first reigning woman. But here's the cruel twist of fate. Matilda was not crowned. Why? Because power is not only seized, it must be kept. And Matilda, trained as an empress, raised among courtiers and kings, made a fatal mistake. She demanded too much. She taxed too harshly. She refused compromise. When the citizens of London begged for relief, she spurned them. When allies asked for rewards, she delayed. Pride, they whispered, arrogance. And in the dead of night, while she slept within reach of coronation, the city turned. Bells rang, mobs gathered, stones rained down upon her retinue. Matilda fled in haste, her dream of a crown dissolving into dust. Matilda's flight from London in June 1141 was more than a retreat, it was a fracture in destiny itself. Imagine the scene. A woman who had once been Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, who had watched kings kneel before her father, forced to scramble through back alleys under torchlight, jeered at by the very citizens who only days earlier had cheered her arrival. The bells of London tolled not in celebration, but in warning. The crown was slipping from her grasp. Her enemies wasted no time. Those who had bent the knee to her now whispered of her pride. Chroniclers later accused her of arrogance, of failing to understand the English heart. But perhaps the truth is sharper. She had been raised to command emperors, not to flatter merchants. She treated London as an imperial city, not as a partner in rule. And England, still scarred by Norman conquest, demanded a monarch who bent at least a little. Matilda refused to bend, yet even as she fled, Stephen languished in captivity. His hands were bound, his crown stripped, his throne empty. For a moment, it seemed all was lost for him. His queen, however, was not idle. Queen Matilda of Bologna, another Matilda, proved herself a formidable rival to the Empress. Where the Empress alienated London, Queen Matilda courted it. She opened her treasury, rallied loyalists, and forged alliances with the very bishops who had once sworn fealty to Henry I's daughter. Her loyalty to her husband became legend. Her political skill, the glue holding Stephen's cause together. The war shifted once more. At Winchester, in September 1141, Robert of Gloucester and the Empress clashed with the royalist forces. The battle became chaos, streets choked with soldiers, churches set ablaze, arrows streaking over rooftops. In the midst of it all, Robert was captured, the lifeline of Matilda's cause, the half-brother who had pledged his sword to her claim, dragged away in chains. And so fate played its cruelest hand, a king for a brother. Negotiations followed. Stephen was exchanged for Robert. The king walked free. The balance of war tipped once again. Picture it, Stephen's return to London. Bells ringing now in triumph. Citizens flooding the streets. Banners unfurled. The usurper, no more Stephen, was king again, and Matilda's dream had fractured beyond repair. But the war did not end. No, it dragged on, year after year, in a cycle of siege and starvation. Castles were stormed and burned, rebuilt and stormed again. The land became a wasteland. Chroniclers wrote of corpses hanging from trees, of villages reduced to ash, of men who built castles and filled them with devils and evil men. It was a time when survival itself was treason. Knights turned mercenary, priests turned raiders, peasants turned thieves. To live meant to betray, to starve meant to die. And in the center of it all, Matilda and Stephen, locked in a war neither could win. One winter, Matilda herself nearly perished. At Oxford in 1142, Stephen's forces trapped her within the walls of the castle. Snow fell heavy, covering the land in white silence. Supplies dwindled, hunger gnawed, and then, in one of history's most cinematic escapes, Matilda slipped away in the night. Dressed all in white, cloaked by snow, she crept across the frozen Thames with a handful of knights, silent as ghosts. By dawn, the Empress was gone, and Stephen's prey had slipped through his fingers again. If you had been there, standing on the ice, heart hammering in your chest, snowflakes melting against your skin, would you have dared take that step into the night, knowing one wrong move meant drowning beneath the ice? Matilda's escape became legend, but legends do not win crowns. Her momentum was gone, her cause weakened. Support bled away even as her young sons grew. Henry, the eldest, was watching, learning, waiting for his chance. The Plantagenet line was not finished, not yet. Still, the realm bled. They said openly that Christ and his saints slept, wrote the chronicler of Peterborough. That phrase has haunted centuries, a lament for a land without order, where the holy itself seemed absent. And so the question deepened. Was this war truly about one woman's right to rule? Was it about something darker? A kingdom cursed by ambition, doomed to bleed until its rulers learned humility. By the mid-1140s, England had become a land haunted by ruin. The Anarchy was no longer a war of two rivals, but a sickness that seeped into the bones of the kingdom. Roads were unsafe, fields untended, and just if it existed at all was bought with silver or sharpened steel. Travelers spoke of waking to the sound of church bells, not in joy but in warning. 4 raiders prowled the countryside like wolves. Stephen clung to his throne, but it was a throne of shadows. Every gain he made was clawed back in blood. Every ally he courted was one betrayal away from defection. His queen, Matilda of Boulogne, had been his fiercest champion, but by 1152, illness dragged her into the grave. Without her, his resolve dimmed. His body aged, his face lined, his crown heavy, and in the west, in Normandy, a boy was becoming a man. Henry, born in 1133, eldest son of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet. From the cradle, his mother whispered destiny into his ears. You are the son of an emperor. You are the grandson of a king. You will not live as a mere duke, you will rule as a king. By 15, Henry had fire in his veins and an appetite for risk. In 1147, while his mother's fortunes waned, he took a reckless gamble. With a ragtag band of mercenaries and almost no money to pay them, he sailed across the Channel, intent on claiming the English throne for himself. It was madness. His tiny force was laughable compared to Stephen's might. Within weeks, his funds ran dry, his men restless. But fate intervened with irony so sharp it feels like theater. Stephen himself, the King Henry, sought to depose, personally funded his return. Why? Perhaps mercy, perhaps calculation, perhaps the weariness of a man who had seen too much blood. Whatever the reason, Stephen spared the boy, sending him back across the sea. But Henry did not vanish. He returned to Normandy, hardened, wiser. He watched his parents' failures and resolved not to repeat them. Geoffrey Plantagenet carved Normandy into submission, and when he died in 1151, Henry inherited it all. At just 18, Henry was Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, and then came a marriage that would change history. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe, recently divorced from Louis VII of France. Bold, beautiful, and politically brilliant, Eleanor controlled vast lands stretching across southwestern France. In 1152, Henry married her, uniting Anjou, Normandy, and Aquitaine under his banner. Overnight, the boy became a force that rivaled kings. His dominion stretched from the Channel to the Pyrenees, and England, weary and broken, lay just across the water. Imagine being Stephen then, a king growing old, his heirs fragile, his realm in tatters, and across the sea, a young lion gathering strength, his lands swelling, his ambition sharpened by years of exile. But before Henry could seize England, fate delivered yet another twist. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, was groomed for the throne. Proud, hot-tempered, ruthless. In 1153, as Henry gathered armies and prepared to invade, Eustace fell suddenly ill. Chroniclers claim he died while pillaging church lands, struck down by divine judgment. His death gutted Stephen. With no strong heir, the king's future collapsed like a castle wall under siege. His banners flew high, his armies disciplined. Town after town welcomed him, not as a conqueror, but as salvation. For after nearly 2 decades of anarchy, the people longed not for Stephen or Matilda, but for peace. And Henry carried peace like a promise written in steel. The climax came at Wallingford. Stephen and Henry faced each other across the Thames, their armies bristling, the air thick with the scent of summer dust and iron. But neither army moved. Exhaustion weighed heavier than armor. The barons, sick of war, begged for truce. Bishops, tired of famine and plague, pressed for peace. And in that standoff, history bent. Stephen, broken by grief for Eustace and weariness for endless war, agreed to negotiate. In November 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford was sealed. Stephen would remain king until his death, but he named Henry as his heir. Think of that moment. The son of Matilda, once a fugitive in white across the snows of Oxford, now heir to the very throne stolen from his mother. When Stephen died a year later, in 1154, Henry rode into Westminster not as usurper, not as exile, but as king. Crowned Henry II, he became the first of the Plantagenets, founder of a dynasty that would rule England for 3 centuries. And yet, in that coronation, one shadow remained: Matilda herself. She had never worn the crown she was promised. She had never been queen. But through her iron will, her unbending pride, her sons inherited the realm. If you had stood in Westminster Abbey that day, incense thick in the air, Henry crowned in gold, would you have thought of the woman who should have stood there first? Would you have whispered her name? The war was over. The Treaty of Wallingford had silenced the clash of steel, and Henry II's coronation in 1154 opened a new chapter for England. But for Matilda, the woman who had sparked the storm, the story did not end with peace. When Stephen's crown passed to her son, She was no longer the fiery claimant riding into London or the white-cloaked fugitive slipping across the ice of Oxford. She was 52, her body wearied by childbirth, exile, and the scars of ambition. She withdrew to Normandy, to the lands her marriage to Geoffrey Plantagenet had secured. There, in Rouen and Le Mans, she found something she had rarely known: quiet, but not silence. Matilda was never silent, though she would never again ride into battle or summon armies. She became something more subtle: an advisor, a whisper in her son's ear, a presence in the decisions of a dynasty just being born. Henry, fierce and restless, respected her judgment. Letters survive that show him seeking her counsel, even on matters as grave as disputes with the church. Imagine that, a king, founder of the mighty Plantagenet line, still bowing to the wisdom of the mother who had once carried England's hopes on her shoulders. Yet Matilda's retreat was not exile. Normandy needed her. While Henry ranged across his empire from Scotland to Aquitaine, she governed in his absence. Chronicles speak of her sense of justice, of her insistence on law and order, of her deep piety. The woman once scorned as arrogant in London became known in Rouen as the Lady of Mercy, mediating disputes, protecting monasteries, and endowing churches. Still, the weight of her unclaimed crown lingered. Every time she looked at Henry, perhaps she saw the reflection of what might have been: her coronation, her reign, her legacy under her own name rather than through her son's. Did she feel bitterness or quiet triumph that her blood still ruled? Here is the twist that few know. While England remembered her as the Empress who failed, Normandy remembered her as a ruler in her own right. The chronicles there call her Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English, never queen, but never forgotten. And yet, even in her twilight, shadows clung to her story. The scars of the Anarchy could not be erased. Villages lay abandoned, castles crumbled, families torn apart. The chroniclers wrote of famine, of cannibalism whispered in dark winters, of fields untilled for years. Matilda had fought for her right, but at what cost to the land she claimed to love? Was her pride the engine of England's suffering ore? Was it Stephen's usurpation that had cursed the realm? Even now, the question hangs unanswered, a riddle without end. Her sons carried the legacy forward. Henry II was relentless, building an empire that stretched farther than any English king before him. Geoffrey became Count of Nantes. William, her youngest, was raised with dignity, though he sought no throne. And through Henry, the Plantagenet line would produce some of history's most legendary monarchs: Richard the Lionheart, who would ride to crusade, and John, whose misrule would birth the Magna Carta. All traced their blood to Matilda. But what of her final years? In Normandy, Matilda devoted herself to faith. She endowed monasteries, wrote letters to bishops, mediated disputes between nobles. Her life became quieter, but not diminished. She was a woman forged in fire, tempered in ambition, who had learned at last the power of counsel over command. In 1167, at 65 years old, she died in Rouen. Chroniclers say she was buried at the Abbey of Bec at first, but later her body was moved to Rouen Cathedral. Her tomb bore an inscription that still echoes her strange place in history. Here lies the daughter, wife and mother of kings, not queen, never queen, always defined by the men around her. Henry I's daughter, Henry V's wife, Henry II's mother. Yet between those lines is a silence louder than stone. She was more than the titles carved for her. She was the woman who could have changed England forever if you had stood at her tomb, candlelight flickering over the carved letters. What would you have felt? Pity for what she lost, or awe for what she made possible? The Empress was gone, laid to rest beneath Rouen stones, remembered in carved Latin as daughter, wife, and mother of kings. Yet Matilda's story did not end with her death in 1167. In truth, it had only just begun. For her legacy lived on, not in a crown upon her brow, but in the bloodline she forged, and the scars she left upon England to understand why Matilda still matters. You must first understand the world she left behind. England in the years after the Anarchy was a wounded beast. Villages had been abandoned, fields left barren, castles rose like jagged teeth across the countryside. The memory of famine, of mercenary cruelty, of priests and peasants alike crying that Christ and his saints slept lingered in every parish. Henry II, her son, set about stitching the land back together. He restored royal justice, demolished unlawful castles, bound barons with law and coin. Where Stephen's reign had fractured, Henry's forged unity. Chroniclers hailed him as one of the greatest kings of his age. And yet, behind his reforms, behind his ambition, behind his relentless energy, was the iron will of a mother who had taught him that crowns are never given, they are taken. Matilda's spirit haunted Henry's reign. In her letters to him, preserved by monks, you can hear the cadence of a woman who had tasted both triumph and defeat. She urged him toward mercy when his wrath burned too hot. She counseled patience when his temper flared. He, the restless king who could never sit still, carried her steadiness with him. Even as he built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, he never forgot the woman who had once fled through snow and ice to keep her claim alive. But Matilda's legacy is not just in Henry. It is in the dynasty she founded. The Plantagenets would rule England for over 3 centuries. Some, like Richard the Lionheart, became legend. Others, like King John, infamous. But all bore the stamp of Matilda. Ambition sharpened to steel, pride unbending, the hunger to rule, and her shadow stretches further still, for it was her struggle, her near-crowned, that forced England to confront a question it had never faced. Could a woman rule as king? In her lifetime, the answer had been no, not because she lacked power or allies or bloodline, but because she was a woman who dared to command like a man. Chroniclers called her arrogant, haughty, unfeminine, but what they truly meant was this: she refused to bow, and in refusing, she set a precedent. She cracked the door that centuries later Elizabeth I and Victoria would stride through. Think of it without Matilda. Would England have been ready to accept queens as sovereigns? Would Elizabeth's golden age have dawned, or Victoria's empire have risen? Or would the crown have remained forever barred to women? Her story is also a warning, for pride and ambition, unchecked, can tear a kingdom apart. The Anarchy remains one of the darkest chapters in English history, a civil war that killed tens of thousands, starved millions, shattered order. Was it worth it? Did Matilda's refusal to yield bring justice, or only suffering? If you were there, standing in a burned village, ash clinging to your skin, children weeping at your side, would you have cursed her name? or whispered it in admiration? History offers no easy answers. That, because Matilda was neither villain nor saint, but something rarer, human. She was brilliant and flawed, commanding and unyielding, betrayed, yet betraying in turn. She lost her crown, but she won immortality. Picture her tomb again, the flicker of candles, the echo of prayers, the carved Latin letters, daughter, wife, mother of kings. The silence between those words is the real legacy, the silence that asks, what if? And so, Empress Matilda remains with us, not as the first queen of England, but as the woman who forced England to imagine one. Her crown may have slipped into history's shadows, but her legacy burns in every monarch who followed, because sometimes the most powerful rulers are not those who sit upon thrones, but those who make the thrones shake.